5, 4, 3, 2. So we should be there
Okay, looks good
shortly.
now.
It looks
Looks
good.
good now. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to do a quick countdown. Hopefully, we've got a few people joining us. Let me just do a quick chink. One watching. Is that right? Yep. No, that's good. Okay. Alrighty. Got a few people joining us there. One watching. That doesn't sound very. Okay. I'll just. All right. And here too.
Oh, there's 4 watching supposedly.
Good.
One of which is probably me. One of whom is probably me.
Yeah. And I'm just putting another link out there as well.
Christ, we don't want to lose our audience when you go away on holiday anymore, Bernard.
Here we go. And another way. Okay. All right. I'm going to do the countdown. Now we've got a few people watching. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, tēnā koutou katoa, and hello again. We're back with the Hoon. Peter Bale, it's
Well,
great to see you.
Bernard, I've already had one email this week from, well, only one email this week, but a nice email from the man who accosted me very kindly in Jervois Road to ask if I was Bernard Hickey's co-presenter. And people have missed us, and I think we've got to sort of work out a way to try and keep this consistent. But Bernard, you've been in Europe. I saw
Yes,
you kept the Kaka going.
in text form. That's right.
Yeah.
So
How
just
was
sort of,
it?
it was really, really good. I had the most lovely time. Now, this is something I'd planned for 3 years now. Lynn and I wanted to have a second honeymoon to
What?
yeah, yeah, and
Yeah, no,
we
I
had a
saw.
yeah, and we had a lovely time. We went to an island in Greece called Andros. We did a home exchange there in an old stone cottage with running water and electricity, but
And not
not
much
much
else.
more. No,
Excellent. But running
but
cats, lots of
lots
cats.
of cats. And anyone who's been to Greece will know that the cats are the most mangy, desperate, evil little suckers you've ever seen. They are
How many did you bring back? How many did Lynn bring back in her handbag?
none, none.
Yeah.
I didn't want to touch them. They were
They
like,
would be a bastard to declare at the airport.
oh my God. They would definitely set off the dogs.
Yeah.
come,
Well, in more ways than one.
come
I think
through
they'd give the dogs at
customs.
the airport a bit of a
Oh,
run
yeah.
for their money. Yeah. And Bernard, you you
Goats to
you,
a
you made a
cat's
fairly deep
footstool.
assessment, I think, of the Greek economy.
Oh, yeah. No, this was a full-on IMF style
Yeah.
analysis.
Yeah.
This was driving around quite a bit on Andros. We rented a car, and basically, it looked like a place where a bomb had gone off in the real estate market in 2010, which is literally it was booming at the time. Everyone was building a second house,
Yeah.
and in
But and
Greece in particular.
only declaring one of their houses to the tax department or none. Yeah.
Exactly. And in Greece, the way you build a house is you build a concrete shell and then
Yep.
fill it with bricks, and then you mortar the bricks, and then you do the house.
Yeah, and you leave
And what
the and
looked
you leave the reinforcing steel sticking out the top, so you can do the second story when you've got the money, right? And also
exactly,
because
and
two-story houses get taxed differently from one-story houses.
yeah, and I'm told in some parts of Europe, if you've still got being half built, you don't have to pay rates fully.
That's
So there's a
exactly
whole
right.
bunch of
So that's
half built places,
yeah,
but
yeah. Thank God
in
we had
Greece,
Roger Douglas, and he just did everything. Everything was straight up and down, and we
clean.
were all
Yeah, yeah.
good, disciplined Kiwis.
And we just didn't tax land at all or wealth or capital
Well, that's
gains.
well, that's a very good way to do it. Yeah,
And so the bomb went off in 2010, the Greek crisis. Everything stopped and basically hasn't started again. So every third or fourth house was actually just a third or fourth concrete shell. And there were hundreds of these all over the place, and an awful lot of abandoned houses. So all the young people had left these islands and gone, if they were lucky, to Athens or to somewhere else in Europe. So there's been a clean out, a lot of old people. And I
excellent.
must
Can we
say,
move it? Can we all go and buy some of those, second and
well, I
third
must say,
houses?
it wasn't that cheap, or at least
Well, when you're spending
You're
euros, it's not. But yeah,
at the moment, yeah, no. So when we were a bit more with a bit more versus the euro, and this is one of the problems, the euro needs to depreciate an awful lot, and
steady on.
um, the
We
Germans
won't
the
have that
Germans
kind of
won't
talk on
let it.
this podcast. Thank you.
No, so that Greece was in perma recession, and it was lovely for us. We had some wonderful swims and walks, and it was gorgeous. And you would go back there in a heartbeat, and certainly the weather was better than it is here at the moment. Then we went to Paris for a week
Yeah,
and
and I
wandered
understand, Bernard,
around.
that you've made an equally acute political analysis of the unrest in France by observing it. You know, you like me. You drive through Northland, and you can write 600 words about the state of Maoridom in Northland, right?
So we were
It's the
there
same as
last
going to
weekend.
Paris and then to Bordeaux.
Yeah. So we were there last weekend when these riots went off. Now, we weren't there in the middle of the riots. They were tended to be on the outskirts of Paris, not where
The banlieue.
yeah. And but in Bordeaux, when we were there, a lot of the rioting happened in the centre of town, in the fancy shopping areas, the pedestrianised streets, which are fantastic for the shops. Normally, when people are shopping, there's hundreds of people wandering up and down these streets, spending their euro. But we walked down the main street in Bordeaux, and every second shop it had their windows smashed in, and the place with the fancy
Oh,
sports
so
shoes.
it was like Thames after a good ram raid that I
There's a
heard
bit of
online
that.
Z this
Yeah,
morning.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Carry on. No, it was a bit more
It
important
was
than a
it
ram
was
raid.
me,
Yeah.
but I certainly didn't feel the. I mean, if you looked at Twitter or whatever you were looking at and tried to work out how things were going in France, you'd think it was on the verge of revolution and the world was about to end.
But
But
in a sense,
actually,
it is, Bernard, isn't it? Because I mean, we might talk about this with Robert, although I don't think. I mean, I don't think that's his area of expertise as such. But in a sense, it is because the right is just letting Macron handle all of this and handle it quite badly, although it has subsided. But there's some very deep-seated. You know that this will be in all the Marine Le Pen campaign things. She's not campaigning on it now because she's just letting him absorb it. So we are heading for quite a nasty. Well, not we because we're not living there at the moment, but the political prognosis for France is quite difficult.
and
Particularly,
for
I mean, did you see, Bernard, that the voluntary contributions to the policeman who shot the poor boy, or who was allegedly shot the poor boy, has gone to went over €1 million, which is far more than the boy's family has received from anybody. It's a nasty situation, and it is one of those sort of social schisms. I also noticed, Ben, that, and not to get away from your holiday, but there were lots of very nasty sort of anti-Islamic people, particularly from the US, diving into this and and spreading some absolutely fabulous disinformation, including clips from Fast and Furious of cars being tossed out of car parks, which comes from and pretending that we're sort of from downtown Paris.
yeah, and I bet they weren't French cars either.
No, no, well, that was what yeah. If it had been a Citroen DS, I would have been crying as I saw it.
Outrage.
Yeah,
Then you would have had real rights.
that's
And
right, that's
yes,
right. Let alone a Renault 4. Yeah.
yeah. No, no, I think you're right. There is a huge undercurrent of unhappiness with how the economy and society have developed the last 20 or 30 years. The same people who are upset about losing in globalization are upset there, but there's the added pain, unlike in the United States where migration hasn't been the main sticking point,
No, well, it's a country of immigrants. Yeah.
it's been the resolution of the original sin in the United States, which is slavery, basically. But in Europe, they have a big problem, which they don't talk about much, but you can sense under the surface, which is that climate change is going to push hundreds of millions of people up from Africa and the Middle East into Europe, simply because that's the only place where you'll be able to live. In the last week or so, in parts of the Middle East and
Yes,
Europe,
go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, parts of the Middle East and Europe, they've been hitting 50 degrees Celsius. The wet bulb temperatures are so high, people are literally, that's it, you die unless you've got air conditioning. And what you're seeing is all these boatloads of people going across the Mediterranean. In fact, while we were in Andros,
Oh, was
One of
that
the
when the
na-
500 people came
yeah,
across and got lost at
yeah.
off
Now it wasn't
Kalamata? Yeah.
our island, but there was a couple of other Greek islands where ships are rocking up and people are unloading and trying to get into Europe, and then they eventually make their way to the Channel crossing and try to get into Britain.
Yeah.
And this is people in Europe understand it that they're at risk when the big climate migration happens, and at the moment they're trying to put up their walls and try to stop it. But as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, the climate crisis appears to have reached some sort of tipping points, and it is starting to get
Yeah, well, did
really
you see? I
ugly.
was thinking it was a very relevant, not to take you away from. Do you want to describe the trip to the centre of, to the Dordogne? I mean, you better just get the whole bloody,
Yeah, yeah.
get your pictures out. Go on,
Well,
tell
we,
us
we
about the
went we went
Dordogne
to
before
Paris,
before
and
I crap on the whole
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
went to Paris, which, by the way, because of the cycling reforms of the last 5 or so years by the new mayor, is a much friendlier, happier place for pedestrians, and felt a lot younger and more vibrant and more together than any other big city I've been in recently. But then, of course, we took the train down to the Dordogne. It was incredibly fast and efficient. And actually,
Did
when
the
we
French government have anything to do with the provision of that train, Bernard? Because I
oh, it
was
was
listening to
wonderful.
that little twerp, the national transport
Miss
spokesman, Simeon, which always makes me
Brown,
think that he's an ape. But
yeah, c'est bon, très
yeah,
bien.
yeah, yeah. Oh, the
Merci
taxpayers.
bien.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Good.
Thank you very much to the French taxpayer for subsidising this amazing train. And of course, the one we went back to Paris on to fly out was extraordinary. We went from Bordeaux to Paris in 2 hours
Yeah,
at
and now, of course,
190.
Bernard, you wouldn't be able to take a plane to compete with that, which was what Simeon Brown was rather. I mean, I actually have some sympathy for this in New Zealand, but I think is it 2.5 hours? The French government has said you can't fly from any of the main centres to anywhere else
Yeah,
within two
and it
and a
was
half centres. You have
noticeable.
to take a train.
The
I mean,
trains were
none of us
absolutely
want to live
packed.
in that kind of socialist super state, but yeah. So
Yeah, yeah,
your diagnosis about the whole of Europe, then, Bernard, having been in Greece and France, do give us it to us.
yeah. Well, yep. Europe faces climate migration, and we do as well at some point. And we were
What from
there.
Australia? Jesus Christ!
No,
Now you're getting me worried.
no. There's 100 million people in North and South Asia who will have the resources to fly into New Zealand and buy citizenship and places in universities for their kids.
Thank God for that. That'll help with the overseas student problem because they'll become domestic students. But yeah,
Yeah, there's that. And as I've said in the past, I think we need to plan for a population approaching 20 million by the time we get to the end of the century, as if only because the pressure from the rest of the world to come here will be high. And also it's a way for us to
to grow.
grow and change the economy and actually have a plan instead of just making it up as we go along and not actually having a discussion about how many people we're going to have here.
Yeah, it was interesting, Bernard. I thought this week you mentioned the climate, and of course it affects population as well. And I think we'll get to housing at some point during this podcast. But the fact that the highest average temperatures ever in the northern hemisphere have been broken, the records have been broken twice this week, and there is this extra, the way we had this heat wave in the oceans around New Zealand over the last 18 months or 2 years or so, where it's 2 to 3 degrees higher than it should have been or higher than average. Europe is going through this, or particularly the Atlantic and the areas around the UK. This is extremely serious.
And we're seeing it too with the melting of the Arctic cap.
And the
There is a
Antarctic.
chance, yeah, and the Antarctic. So there's a chance within the next 2 or 3 years of what they call a blue ocean event. So that's where during the winter, for the first time ever, there'll be no sea ice at the Arctic. The Greenland ice shelves are melting faster than they ever have. We're seeing
We better go. We better fly over there quite soon and go and visit it before it goes. Yeah.
well, I must say, and there were some genuine questions from our subscribers to me in the comment sections of some of my posts from Europe saying, "You talk a lot about climate change, Bernard, but what did you do? How many tons of
Yeah,
carbon did you
but
expend?"
we should actually look into this and get. One of our guests mentioned this to me. One of our guests might have been Bronwyn Nichol. I can't quite remember. That this whole thing, I mean, I've decided to take on entirely, which is that this whole thing of individual responsibility for climate change is an entirely fossil fuel driven thing. So I've decided not to worry about it all and just to travel around talking about it as much as possible while taking the longest possible trips to the farthest flung places.
We need to get you a very, very fast electric car to start with, Peter.
Yeah, but that won't help me for going to Perugia or Spain,
Well, there are some electric planes.
Yeah,
being
they're not
developed,
going to. Yeah,
and,
they're not
and
going
then
to.
you can buy yourself a really
but I think
expensive
that
yacht.
idea of individual responsibility, I think, is a really interesting one. And I think we've got to have this conversation in New Zealand. The government at the moment doesn't seem to want to have a conversation about climate at all.
No, and I reported in today's email a survey that Ipsos has done, which shows that New Zealanders have much less confidence now the government has a plan. But also, New Zealanders have this view that the best thing they can do to deal with climate change is to recycle, which is actually the 60th most useful things you can possibly do.
Yeah.
And the really tough discussions, which are along the lines of to reduce emissions, that means having a different lifestyle.
Yeah.
Now, at the moment, we would often consider that a lesser lifestyle. It would mean more expensive cars, travel, public transport, taxes. And at the moment, everyone in New Zealand is saying, yeah, we need to do something, but it shouldn't affect me. It's going to be someone else.
It shouldn't
who
affect
does
me,
that.
and it shouldn't affect government borrowing, and it certainly shouldn't be built by the public, and it doesn't include infrastructure.
That's right. And so we are at that point where, because the climate change is happening faster than we expected, it's at the rubber hits the road moment, and everyone's looking at each other going, well, you can pay for it. And actually, I'm not quite ready yet for
Well,
this.
actually, I think we're just going to all be building fences. Professor Robert, how are you?
Hi Peter. Hi Bernard.
So good to see you. We've missed you terribly, and I've noticed, Robert, that you've just become an appalling media figure on everybody else's.
Highly productive.
Highly
Not
productive.
boring,
You've been
highly
no.
productive.
You've been amazing. I just want you to know who found you first and who loves you most is us and our audience.
We're really pleased to see you again,
Good to
Robert.
see
And
you.
you're not wearing your Amish Prigozhin beard today.
That was hilarious, wasn't it?
I saw-
Yeah,
This
no, I mean, unlike Mr. Prigozhin, this is the real stuff. But
yeah.
but yeah, I have a nasty feeling that one or two FSB people may have planted those wigs just to embarrass Mr. Prigozhin. But
Oh
who
no, I
knows?
don't think so. I think when you're a master of, if you look at Victor Bout, who of course was the or Boot was the arms dealer exchanged for the basketballer. If you're going to be a global master of disguise, you need to have a couple of pictures on your phone so that you can put your own bloody wig on and make sure it's around the front, not front to
And
back.
apparently the FSB returned the $111 million they found in his place.
So we
might as well
want to
start-
we want
we
to
might as
talk
well
to about
start.
much more important things, but let's talk about this first, because he's gone back. I don't know whether if you saw the pictures of his house, which was surprisingly garish. I mean, who could possibly imagine that a former convict and now, multi-million dollar mercenary leader and all-round scumbag would have slightly ostentatious taste? But the number of weapons that were also sort of just littered around the house was pretty extraordinary. And then I've seen figures between $37 million that was in a van, literally that was in a van just being driven out of the Wagner thing when the cops arrived the other day, and then something like $100 million having been that he's just retrieved today. I'm wondering, Robert, I mean, not that you have particular insight to this, but you'll have a witty, a pithy response to it. The fact that he has been allowed to go to St. Petersburg, clean up his house, vacuum the floors, double lock it so that the FSB don't get in again, or the GRU don't get in again, suggests to me that there is something deeply fishy about this alleged agreement with Putin, and therefore something even fishier than we thought possibly with the mutiny itself.
Yes, I think it highlights the limits of the control that we assumed that Mr. Putin had. You can't really... I think the invasion of Ukraine has severely weakened Mr. Putin's domestic political power, and I think the Prigozhin episode highlights that. It's almost inconceivable, even a year ago, that Mr. Putin wouldn't have exacted some sort of terrible revenge or retribution for having the temerity to oppose the boss. And he's a long-time associate.
Absolutely. But I think we know both. He wasn't necessarily opposing the boss. He was trying to expose Shoigu.
He was. I mean, let's be quite clear.
Or was the mutiny a way to flush out General Armageddon?
I think, first of all, he's been opposing Putin for some time by continually blasting in public Mr. Shugoi and Gerasimov, the head of the army. He is in effect rubbishing Mr. Putin.
Yeah.
And the other thing was, on the eve of the mutiny, he did something extraordinary. You're quite right. He, for a long time, presented himself as a Putin loyalist who was frustrated that the Ministry of Defense in Russia were not giving him enough ammunition to do a more effective job with the invasion.
Yeah.
Suddenly, on the verge of the mutiny and the day before the mutiny, he completely changed his narrative. He said that the invasion of Ukraine was based on lies. It was bogus.
Yeah, exactly.
Ukraine was no threat to Russia, and lots of people lost their lives for no good reason. And this is why I'm surprised that so far
he's alive.
Mr. Prigozhin has not, as far as we know, fallen out of a window or drunk his last cup of tea. Because
I think there's a lot. How's this guy still alive?
Well, I think he's clearly getting a lot of support.
Yeah.
I think it's no secret that senior sections of the Russian military did not want to invade Ukraine in the first place. That they seem to have a much more accurate assessment of Ukraine than Mr. Putin did. And it's also quite clear, given that Mr. Putin arrested 100 members of the FSB almost immediately in the first month of the invasion, there was opposition there as well. So I think Mr. Putin's reluctance to move on Prigozhin, if that's what it is, may be purely linked to the fact that at the moment he doesn't feel strong enough to do so. Of course, within another month, he may feel strong enough to do so, in which case Mr. Prigozhin needs to be very careful.
Yeah, on the other hand, this could all be, I mean, I look, I don't want to, David Moring in our chat raises the question about whether this is some sort of elaborate charade to expose those in the Russian military who might be opposed to Putin, or, it's a very difficult and complex that the lines of this are going to get redrawn and redrawn, a couple of times. Lukashenko today is so, he's at a press conference this morning. Steve Rosenberg from the BBC's done an astounding report, if you want to search for that. Not you, Robert, because I'm sure you've already read it. But, it's all so elliptical. It's also sort of Soviet. It's kind of...
Well, this is what happens with authoritarian regimes. It's all...
Yeah.
You have to decode every phrase.
We might have to get Helen Clark in to talk about that, actually.
What we do know is that Lukashenko has got a bit of a spring in his step recently, because he, I think... has been worried about Belarus being forced into Russia, that is becoming part of Greater Russia. That was always Putin's intention, by the way. But he feels that he may have got a bit more wiggle room now, because he's helped out the boss when the boss was in a sticky point.
But he's also brought the boss's pit bull in.
He has. It's a very interesting situation. One thing that intrigues me, however, is that Prigozhin's challenge was carefully thought out. This was not a spontaneous...
or one assumes so.
And it clearly helped. It was an inside job. He clearly had a lot of encouragement. I mean, we do know that one of the top generals in the Russian army is now being detained, Sirokov. And
Surovkin, you mean?
Yeah, Surovkin, sorry. And
Christ, you're supposed to be the academic and know all these people.
Oh, I know. I always forget names, but never mind.
Carry on.
We're all fallible.
What?
Yeah, except, of course, if you're Vladimir Putin, and then you're infallible.
Exactly. So what I'm curious about is why the Ukrainians seem to be just doing the whole slow thing when they could have, in theory, had a really good crack at it while the Russians were looking in their backyard.
I think they are, but the problem that the Russians are well dug in, and the Russians have been expecting this, but I think they are making progress. it's predicted by the end of this month, Bakhmut would have fallen to the Ukrainians. They're also carrying out what many strategic analysts call continued shaping and softening operations. They are every night bombing key Russian installations. So I think
Did you see the one? I mean, it was perfect for the 4th of July, which was a disused apartment block in the center of a population, just with absolutely going up like a rocket, as it were.
Yeah, but we're getting one of those a night, basically.
Yeah.
Major ammunition dumps. So when we talk about the counteroffensive, people think they have visions of Ukrainian troops surging through the front lines, a bit the way they did in Kharkiv and Kherson in the last quarter of last year. I think because it's a 1,000-mile front line, and because the Russians are well dug in, I think the Ukrainians have switched tactics. I think what they're trying to do is basically immobilize the Russian defensive positions by cutting off their supplies, or at least complicating their supplies,
which they can do with HIMARS.
And they haven't committed yet the major body of the force they've been training. So I think it's early days. I think a lot of people expected a sort of blitzkrieg counteroffensive. The Ukrainians, if you listen to Bodanov, people like that, who's head of the military intelligence, they're saying that they're probably thinking the decisive moment will probably come round about October, maybe late September. This is when they're hoping that's when they really put the Russian forces to flight. But it will be a systematic softening up. And why are they engaging in this softening up? Why don't they just get on with it? Because the Ukrainians have taken a lot of casualties in the operation so far, and they want to minimize that. And so you can understand it. If you're Zelensky and the military command of Ukraine, and someone says to you, well, we can minimize the casualties by softening them up for the next 3-4 months, and then committing forces, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, Patrick Clark points out, of course, they don't have any air support. I read in The Economist today, which has an excellent analysis of all this, that the Ukrainians are losing 10,000 drones a week. So let's go down to PB Tech and buy a couple of DJIs and send them over there. I mean, it's just absolutely extraordinary what's going on there and the way it's reshaping the battlefield and the battle. Now, Robert, one thing though, just to bring you back to an area that really is in your wheelhouse, not that that's a word that should ever be mentioned in this podcast, wheelhouse, is Chris Hipkins this afternoon announced a sort of new defence review, which is very much aligned to this. I mean, some people who have columns or used to have columns in North and South have written about this for a little while, possibly aided by people like Robert Patman and your student Geoffrey Miller, that New Zealand is going to have to redraw its defence strategy. And it's not unrelated to Ukraine, partly because we have the people still, I believe, at NATO headquarters and at High Wycombe helping with targeting and helping with intelligence analysis.
This is where the New Zealand government brings PB Tech into the military.
Well, no, I think that would be a lot better than having as someone pointed out to me, having $500 million worth of ships that they don't have enough people to sail out from Devonport. But Robert, the Chris Hipkins thing, just to shall I explain what did you have a look at it? Have you? I
did. I read it carefully.
Well,
it's a really interesting speech.
Why don't you summarize it for us, please?
Well, I think there were 3 key takeaways. First of all, Chris Hipkins said, having been in the job for a number of months, he's become more convinced than ever of the importance and the soundness of New Zealand's independent foreign policy, its independent approach. Secondly, he refused in the speech to take sides in what is, as he puts it, a worrying and more difficult security environment for New Zealand. He mentioned the complex relationship with China, but he also said that relations with the United States and Australia, it was Australia first, then the United States, were excellent. So from his point of view, it's back to basics. He's reconfirmed the importance of an independent foreign policy, but he's making a distinction. He, like his predecessor and Jacinda Ardern, he's refusing to lump 2 authoritarian states, China and Russia, together. And what's interesting is here comes the nuance. He wants to have a warm and constructive relationship with China, but he doesn't want to gloss over the differences. But when it comes to Russia, and this was, of course, on the eve of his visit to Lithuania and NATO summit, he said, we must do everything to support the international effort to reverse the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And he explicitly said we must support the defeat of Russia. So it's, in a sense, he's not joining a camp. He's not sort of saying we're against all authoritarian states.
No, and he's aligning himself with Albanese's rather moderate approach to this.
Yeah.
Without saying I'm going to overturn the non-nuclear policy.
I think there's a third element here which is very important, and this is different, and that is he's saying that we have to spend much more on security and defence in order to preserve our independent foreign policy position. He said, and that
this has
in
been
the eyes
coming
of our,
from you, me, Geoffrey Miller.
Yeah,
probably you're heavily influencing me in all respects, but I think that's going to be a really interesting domestic political thing in the run-up to the election. And I suspect,
it's
as Christopher Luxon did with the China trip, National's going to swing right in behind it, because to do anything else would look ridiculous.
Yeah, but I think in a sense, he did mention AUKUS, but he's really saying if we want to continue to have fruitful relations with the United States, Australia, and all our key allies, we have to demonstrate that we're prepared to do our bit.
Yeah.
And this government has already committed 400 million this year. But I think it's interesting because when it came to AUKUS, there's been a bit of a debate, as you know, in this country about what we should do there. I think he basically sided with those who are saying, wait and see, don't commit ourselves. Because
but he did say in there, Robert, that we need a viable military unit or a viable military capability, and I suspect that is going to mean, or I'm not going to ask you actually. My supposition would be, having just heard Chris Hipkins say this, is that that's going to be a recommitment to the New Zealand SAS and to New Zealand intelligence gathering, because it's the two things that we're really good at. Although he also talked about helping the Pacific defend itself more effectively, which possibly means something more in the naval area.
Yes, I think what is clever about Hipkins' strategy is that I think he's shying away from picking a side, which he believes is not in New Zealand's best interest. And I think he's right. But also he's indicating he's prepared to do a lot more on the defence front than previous prime ministers, because he recognises, in his speech, he alluded to two distinctive new threats. One was what he called the cyber intrusions. He didn't name the countries involved, but he made it quite clear there were state-sponsored cyber intrusions. I think they would probably be Russia and China.
Yeah.
But he also indicated that New Zealand had become a target. Again, he didn't elaborate, but he made it clear that New Zealand was a target for misinformation and disinformation. And as he put it, we were almost a niche target. And I think that was a hint that the protests against the anti-vaccination protests in the grounds of Parliament had been effective by narratives on the social media from other countries.
Well, I remember on the days of the marches to Parliament in February of last year, being absolutely stunned to see Russian flags being flown by the protest marchers.
Yes.
This was actually at the time of the invasion of Ukraine, and all sorts of banners saying, go Putin, he's great. And I was like, surely that's a joke, right? Surely this is like some sort of post-modern, ironic thing. But no, these were serious. These people were like...
Irony has died when those people get involved. Now, Bernard, do you think that the New Zealand public, in the run-up to an election in October, and I know we're going to get to V on housing shortly, do you think the New Zealand public is going to accept a significant increase in defence spending, or understand it?
The key thing will be where the Treasury accepts it, because we.
The Treasury. Hipkins would not have said that today without the Treasury being on board, surely.
Well, there's been lots of talk about extra investment and all sorts of things over the years, and essentially Treasury comes back as no debt track, debt track, and we've actually got 30 years now of of underinvestment in all sorts of infrastructure, including defence, where, Robert, I think we're down to, is it almost 1.5% of GDP? Is that right?
I think it boosts. I think it was down around about just under 1%. But I think with the 400 million extra allocated early in the year by Chris Hipkins' government for defence, I think that's boosted to about 1.3. But it's still quite a bit below the 1.5 that many liberal democracies are spending on
and certainly below
security.
the 2% proposed for NATO. Now,
Yeah.
is it
And
your belief?
Australians
And I
too,
know, yeah, sorry, but is it your belief, Robert? Before we go to V on housing, because I know Bernard will want to spend at least 40 minutes on that and extend the podcast for a couple of hours, possibly.
There's
to
a
talk about
good
housing.
15 minutes on housing.
Yeah.
Well, it's important.
Hipkins is about to go to NATO. Is Geoffrey Miller right to suggest that we're going to join some kind of NATO plus Indo-Pacific unit? It's kind of been coming, and also if Chris Hipkins were to be able to say, as he's sitting in the cheap seats at NATO at Vilnius this week, I think it's Vilnius, we're going to go for 2% of GDP for defence, same as is supposedly a floor for NATO.
Well, I mean, I'm not privy to Jeffrey's information. I'm not sure.
I'm sure you told him everything to say.
No, not at all.
No,
He's very much
He's
an
your
independent
student.
actor, believe it or not. But I look, New Zealand believes in multilateral approaches to security. Therefore, we're quite wary of coalitions of the willing, such as AUKUS, three English-speaking countries, basically taking it upon themselves to defend the whole of the Indo-Pacific against the Chinese threat.
Yeah.
But we quite like the idea of joining together 29 other liberal democracies and working together in a defensive alliance. So, it wouldn't surprise me if New Zealand stepped up its relationship, although I haven't heard about this initiative about some sort of NATO force in the Indo-Pacific.
I
There'd
think
be
it's
quite a
more
bit
of,
of
I think it's
resistance.
more of a sort of an association rather than a,
But we're already a partner. We signed
Yeah.
an agreement in 2012, which has been extended already. So, look, I think the relationship will continue to deepen between the Europeans who make up much of NATO and New Zealand. While Mr. Hipkins is in Europe, of course, he's signing a free trade agreement with the EU. So, this country sees its worldview actually is quite close to many countries in Europe, not Britain.
And what
but
do you
the
make, Robert,
EU.
of there was a very subtle thing which Patrick Smelly, our friend from Business Desk, called out in his piece about this, that while Chris Hipkins was glad-handing Xi Jinping, Nanaia Mahuta was allegedly getting a bollocking from the foreign ministry. What do you make of that? Because I think we've said before that my personal view, not that it matters necessarily, is that Nanaia Mahuta has actually guided a very subtle and difficult foreign policy quite well. Chris Hipkins seems to have picked up the Jacinda thing quite well as well, although it's certain bits of it have got a bit harder. What did you make of that China?
Well, it certainly sounded like the good cop, bad cop routine where Mahuta said everything that Hipkins wanted to say to the Chinese but felt restrained from doing so, and therefore walked into a first-class row with her Chinese counterpart. And Hipkins was left to deliver, do all the niceties with the Xi Jinping.
Well, I thought that was a really good example though, of Chinese diplomacy, that you don't embarrass Chris Hipkins, but you do communicate something quite effective to Nanaia Mahuta. Not that anybody wants to see her bollocked, but that actually seemed to be a perfectly valid. Both of them seem like valid diplomatic tactics.
Yeah, I get the feeling, just as I did with the Jacinda Ardern leadership, that the Chris Hipkins leadership is not going to take a backward step on all core values, commitment to democracy and human rights. We're a relatively small player, but I think no one in this country would accept a sort of master-servant relationship with China, whereby we had access to this huge market, but we sort of dumbed down on our commitments that matter to most New Zealanders.
Yeah, but we're also going to have to do with the master-servant relationship with the United States. But I think you're right that we're
I don't think we'd accept that either.
relatively, yeah, exactly. So it's a difficult balancing act. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And the segue here, talking about human rights, is the Human Rights Commission's big report this week into the housing market. We'd like to welcome V. Blackwood on to the Hoon, who is the manager of the big inquiry the Human Rights Commission has done over the last couple of years. A really significant piece of work, investigation, reporting on the depths of our housing crisis. V, thank you very much for coming onto the show.
Kia ora, thank you for having me.
Now, just for those people who haven't been following the Commission's work over the last couple of years, could you give us a sense of how this developed and what you've been doing to come up with this final report this week?
Yeah, absolutely. So when the Chief Commissioner, Paul Hunt, came on board to the Human Rights Commission, he brought with him a very strong focus on what are called economic social rights. So these are the human rights that New Zealand has committed to. We've signed up to them in many different international conventions. We've made commitments at the international level that our governments are bound by, but they don't appear in the Bill of Rights Act, and they generally cost more money to deliver on because they're rights like the right to healthcare and an adequate standard of health, and the right to a decent home. And so when Paul joined the Commission, he said that we have, including the Human Rights Commission itself, has largely neglected these rights. We've focused a lot on civil and political rights, which are also, of course, very important, but rights like these really go to the heart of people's ability to live in dignity. And it's also very difficult for someone to think about their civil and political rights, about engaging in elections, thinking about who to vote for, when they're struggling just to put a roof over their head. They are, really preoccupied with the housing crisis and so on. And so that was the history of why we've chosen to focus on the right to a decent home. In 2020 and 2021, we developed guidelines on the right to a decent home, and then using those guidelines as a lens, we launched the housing inquiry, and that's what we've been working on for the last 2 years.
And what did you find? From my point of view, having covered housing for 20 years or so and seen the increasing number of people who are homeless, who are living in mouldy, cold homes, looking at the sheer numbers about affordability, the very high proportion of disposable income that renters in particular have to pay. It's clear to me that our housing situation is a stain on the country, let alone a drag on our society and politics. But what did you find in those couple of years?
Well, Bernard, I think you're right, that anyone who works on housing or who has a focus on housing, whether that's working on the front line or looking at the data as you have, wouldn't be surprised what we found, because we found just the same. But what we brought to it was the human rights lens. So we wanted to show that the right to a decent home isn't abstract. It's got really key features that can be measured, and government's obligation is to make progress. So progress towards those key measures, progress towards housing being more affordable, more habitable, more sustainable and accessible over time. And in too many instances, we found just the reverse. In fact, when we released our measuring progress work, we found that across 6 out of the 7 indicators, the data showed that we either weren't making enough progress, were going backwards, which was for affordability. Housing has got dramatically less affordable over the last 3 decades, and that affordability is not affecting everyone equally in society either. There are certain groups in society that are experiencing that much more acutely. And then on top of that, we found that the government and the housing system in general really don't have sufficient accountability mechanisms to ensure that where things go wrong or where policies aren't delivering, that there is constructive accountability, independent review.
It's Peter here. Do you think that the New Zealand public, writ large, understands what the role of the Human Rights Commission is and why you get into these deeply fundamental issues?
I think it's, I respect that it's quite difficult because the Human Rights Commission does have a lot of different functions. And so this is one of our functions. But because we've got such a broad mandate, it can be a little bit difficult to see how we, interact on everything. But one of our functions is to research and to inquire into any issues that we think may be human rights issues. And the housing crisis in New Zealand is absolutely a human rights issue. When the UN Special Rapporteur came to New Zealand in 2020, she called it a human rights crisis. And that should have been a warning sign for the government then. But, even then, too little has been done to turn it around.
So, what is the Human Rights Commission recommending as ways to hold government accountable? Having reported on this area for so long and pointed fingers at people saying this is outrageous, and everyone says, sure, and then nothing happens. How would you, and what are the recommendations on accountability?
So, one of our recommendations is that the right to a decent home needs to be implemented into New Zealand legislation. So that could be through amending the Kāinga Ora Homes and Communities Act or passing a new National Housing Strategy Act, essentially saying that the right to a decent home is recognised in New Zealand law and that all housing policies initiatives must have as one of their goals promoting that right. But alongside that, the accountability piece is so important to have an independent agency, a watchdog, I think I've seen it described in media in the last couple of days, that can review strategies, policies, say, how is this progressing your human rights obligations? If it is progressing them, fantastic, great, keep on with the good work. If it's not making progress, they have the opportunity to say, no, that's not good enough, go back to the drawing board and try again, because these human rights
Yeah.
are fundamental.
Who can help explain it? Because I think you're in a very difficult year with an election in less than 100 days now. Your work or the office of the Human Rights Commissioner will get politicised to some extent. This is possibly the most well. Actually, I can think of 2 or 3 other political things that you could get involved in. We'll definitely have you on. What can the New Zealand media do to explain your role or your organisation's role more effectively, and also the obligations? Because I worry sometimes when I look at these issues that it comes down to the you've got to look after yourself. You've got to individual responsibility, and we know where those kinds of conversations lead you into an interesting and difficult racial New Zealand conversation. I'm not sure that those obligations that you refer to are terribly well understood by people, or including in the media.
I agree, and that's one of the pieces that we've tried to work on. So we've put together tools, resources, guidance that's available now on our website as a toolkit. The obligations one is important, and one of the misconceptions that I hear a lot is, well, we can't just go out and give everyone a home overnight. People have to work for it, and that does misrepresent what the right to a decent home involves. It's not about giving everyone for free a decent home. It's about the government making the conditions possible that everyone can access decent housing, whether that's through private rentals, through owner occupation, through other forms of, home tenure. And what we've seen all too often is that government is just not doing that. They are not making the conditions possible where everyone
So,
can
but before
access.
Bernard then brings you into
Yeah.
other areas of this obligation, so how do you? I know this sounds naive of me, but I've been away for a long time. How does the organisation operate in that political climate? What influence? Where does your influence come from? Is it through the government, or is it because you presumably also have
So,
great connections
yeah.
to the opposition?
So we are an independent Crown entity, which means that we are independent of government, and that independence is very hard protected. And for that reason, it's very important to make clear that, perhaps despite what some people would say, we do aim, human rights are apolitical. And perhaps that's naive of me to say, but they're apolitical in the sense that they go beyond politics. Every government, no matter their political colour, is obliged to follow and progress the rights that they've promised to deliver. And so as a result, we try and make it clear that human rights don't say which way you have to develop your policies to get to the destination, only that the point is you get to the destination. And so that's what we're trying to encourage as well, to encourage every MP across Parliament to think about their housing policies and whether they effectively deliver on these rights that they've promised for every New Zealander.
Thanks, Fee. I just think that would be great to get that better understood. I don't fully understand it, and I'm sure a lot of people don't. But thank you.
Kia
Bernard.
ora.
And just trying to understand too New Zealand's commitments as a sovereign nation under the United Nations to do certain things, which we sort of ignore, but and there's no UN police force coming to take the prime minister away and put them in prison or anything silly. But these are legal agreements and they should be reflected in the way the government operates. Could you talk a bit more about what those are and how they factor into the government?
That's right. So these are legal commitments, as you've said, they should factor. And what we've said is that when policymakers in housing and urban development, for example, are developing their housing policy, they aren't asked when they report up to Cabinet, does this policy that you've developed for us effectively deliver on our legal obligations in international law? They aren't asked, does this accord with the human rights obligations we have? They look at whether it's compliant with the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, but if it's a commitment that's not in the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, it's missing in action. And that's one of the reasons we'd like to see the right to a decent home enshrined into New Zealand legislation so that it's less easy to ignore, less easy to forget about.
So we're just about to go into an election campaign, and I'm not going to ask you to make judgments or, say
Oh no,
what the
please
various
do.
party. You look like you've got a long career ahead of you, which is great. But as from the point of view of me as a journalist who's going to be asking various political parties for their housing policies and comparing and contrasting and trying to work out how it fits into all of this, what sort of questions should I be asking of the political parties on their housing policies that would answer some of the recommendations that you've made here? For example, the first thing I'm going to ask all the main parties is, do you agree we should have a housing ombuds person as one of them? But what other sort of questions should we be throwing at the politicians?
Yeah, that's a really great question, actually. And we would love it, obviously, if more journalists did ask these hard questions. One of the things that I would suggest that you ask is, how does your housing policy move forward, making the right to a decent home real? How does it treat housing as a fundamental human need, not just as an investment commodity? That's not to say that people can't make money off housing. People make money off, running businesses, and yet if you run a business, you have obligations to treat your employees fairly. And so running rental housing should be no different. And so I think pushing politicians more on how their housing policy will actually effectively move forward. What I will say is, we do have to be apolitical, and I'm a member of the public service, although we're an independent Crown entity. So I certainly wouldn't want to commend any particular party policy. We encourage any party policy in housing that recognises the nature of housing as a human right. And we were dismayed to see the retraction of the bipartisan medium residential density work, because that was really positive as a move, that housing, if we're going to make these human rights real, I think that we have to stop treating housing as a political football. And so it was really positive to see bipartisan agreement across the House to try and move forward. And so to see that retracted now is disappointing. I would hope and encourage, politicians in future to think about how they can work together more in that space, which again might be naive in the election
Oh,
period,
no,
but we
no,
can
no,
live in hope, you know?
no. These are exactly the questions I'll be looking to ask Viv Blackwood, the
V, thank you
manager
so much.
of
Thank
the
you.
Human Rights Commission's inquiry into housing. Thank you very much for coming onto the Hoon. Lovely to have you on.
Thank you.
Cheers. And that will be one of the main areas that I try to focus on the next 99 days
Yeah,
before the
we were
election.
talking about. I thought that was interesting the other day. I thought she was terrific, Bernard. Also, this idea that doesn't matter how you get there, but the objective has got to be to provide, or that everybody can has the
And
access
that,
to these things. And David
and
Mooring made a point,
none of
and
the
I
parties
think
have
it's
actually said what success looks like when they
yes,
talk
exactly.
about things like, or how warm a house should be, or how dry a house should be. We've got
Yeah,
some measures here and there forcing put heat pumps in and that sort of thing, but actually we have no real national target which says we want to make sure no one pays more than 50% of their income in rent or
yeah.
or
Doesn't have to necessarily even be because that covers the whole renting thing. It just covers. We might have once called this just having a
yeah,
fair go on
and
housing.
unfortunately because housing has become the reason
Biggest
for our
single
economy.
investment.
Yeah,
I believe
and
that we're a housing market with an economy attached. Is that right, Bernard?
exactly, no, this
Not that
someone
anyone's
said
ever said
this.
that before. Yeah.
And every time I look at the problems we have in our society, you always come back to it's all about the housing. And it was really instructive to me that going back down, having been in Paris and Athens, other things, Auckland had more homeless people, more people who are clearly mentally ill, asking for money, desperate situations than either Paris or
In Herne Bay and
Athens
Freeman
had.
and Freeman's Bay, I don't think so.
Yeah, but not far off in the middle of
Yeah, I
town.
know, I know, I
Yeah,
know.
no,
But Bernard,
it's
we discussed this when we had lunch yesterday. What are you going to do for your election coverage to make it
yeah,
more than just the horse race about who's up, who's down, and whether Chris eats fucking sausage rolls or the
yeah.
other one is bald? What are you
I,
gonna
I,
do?
well, one of the things I've taking time off for not a holiday, but it's some time away gives you a chance to reflect on what you want to do that's different. And one of the things I really want to do over the next 99 days is spend a lot more time talking about solutions. Some people call it solutions journalism. So this is instead of trying to report the horse race, who's going to win, who's going to lose, who's looking better, who's looking worse, what does the poll say? Lots of people already do that. What I'd like to look at is what are the actual policies and solutions that the various parties are putting forward. And if then none of those look like they're going to work or are actually going to happen, what policies should be there? And because one of the privileges and opportunities we have with the Kaka is because of the support of all of our subscribers, we're not looking after the interests of a particular company or
Yeah,
interest group or
yeah.
political party. We can say, here's what we think from our assessment of the policies and what we know
When you
would,
say we, this is going to be you, isn't it? Because it's not going to be me. I can help you with it, but Bernard,
yeah.
do you maybe need some sort of? I mean, I think our audience could possibly help you with this, don't you?
Yeah, well, I often ask people in our chat sections, and I
Yeah.
see fantastic information, tips, questions in the comments from paying subscribers regularly, which get me to think about things in a different way,
Yeah.
that point me to information sources I hadn't thought of. And as the Kaka has become more than just my reporting or interviewing or commentary. There's a lot more stuff below the fold, if you like, comments from people, and also in the section that I find very useful and others find useful as well. And I think there's a role during the election campaign for us to try to report on the various
All right. Well, why don't you and
policies
I,
and come up
because
with some
I,
solutions.
as you know, I hesitate to comment on New Zealand politics more than just saying I quite like the fact that David Seymour has a Lotus Super 7, or Caterham, I think it is a version of that. But we should look at this because I think it's a really innovative way to, it's an interesting way to try and do it, Bernard, and I think it will set you apart because I think there's some really, there's some very interesting things happening in this election.
Yeah,
It's there,
and I
it's
think
there to look, you know.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and there is a model around called solutions journalism, which is
Yep.
where you approach a story not from, he said, she said, or, who's winning and who's losing, but actually here's a problem
All
and
right.
what
So
are the
next week, shall I
solutions in
get?
front of
Would people like it if I got a regional expert on solutions journalism to come in and do 5 minutes to
What a
explain
great
what we're talking
idea.
about?
What a
Oh,
great idea.
and I've got a
Fantastic.
fantastic person in Australia who's, I mean, I'm sorry she's Australian, but, and there's another chap who's in Korea who I've spoken to because I have some background in this solutions area. And I
Fantastic.
wouldn't want to put you into a formula about this, but I think they could bring some,
Absolutely. And a
some
great
perspective to this.
potential Hoon guest on as well, so that people who are the supporters for the kaka can see the sorts of things that we could do that are a bit different.
Yeah, good. All right, Bernard.
Fantastic. Hey, Peter, it's lovely to be back in the harness, if you like, of the Hoon.
Oh, don't tell them about our harness, Bernard. People would really be worried about that then. I have a very funny story to tell you about harnesses, but it involves San Francisco, and I don't think it's
No,
safe for work.
no, no.
NSFW. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's lovely
Thank you,
to see.
everybody. It's lovely to
Thank you
see
very
you.
much, and we shall be back again at 5 o'clock next
And
Friday.
thank God for Simon. Yeah.
Yeah. Ka
Thank you,
kite
everybody.
anō, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cool. Let me just end